Admiral Kyung-ho stood on the bridge of the warship, defiant, watching the tactical display with growing horror. The red dots, representing enemy contacts, were moving across the screen in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They did not follow the normal rules of space combat. Instead, they seemed to appear and disappear at random like nightmares made real. The Void Hunters had finally arrived in force, just as humanity had predicted, but even the human military leaders were shocked by what they saw. These creatures were not just another hostile alien species, they were something far worse than anyone had imagined. Pure entropy given form. They did not conquer worlds or enslave populations, they simply erased everything they touched from existence. The first attacks had come at the galactic rim, where the Scalan Empire had built their most heavily defended fortress worlds. The Scalan fleet was massive and powerful, with ships that could crack planets and weapons that could destroy entire star systems, but their mighty armada proved completely useless against entities that existed partially outside normal space. Admiral Kyung-ho watched through long-range sensors as a Void Hunter touched a Scalan battleship. The massive vessel simply stopped existing. There was no explosion, no wreckage, no debris. One moment it was there firing its weapons, and the next moment there was just empty space, as if the ship had never been built at all. The Void Hunters themselves were difficult to describe or even look at directly. They appeared as tears in reality itself, dark shapes that seemed to be made of the space between atoms. They moved in ways that violated every law of physics, folding space around themselves and stepping through dimensions that normal matter could not access. The crystalline prison lords had tried to use their energy weapons against the approaching threat. Their crystal cities could focus starlight into beams powerful enough to cut through asteroids, but when their weapons hit the Void Hunters, the energy simply vanished into the creatures as if it had never existed. The ancient crystal beings watched in terror as their homeworld was slowly consumed by entities that fed on the very concept of existence. Admiral Kyung-ho received desperate communications from across the galaxy. The same aliens who had mocked human warnings were now begging for help. The Scalan Regent himself appeared on the communication screen, his scales pale with fear and his voice shaking with desperation. "Admiral, please," he said. "We know we were wrong about everything. We should have listened to your warnings. We need human military advisors. We need human technology. Please help us fight these monsters." But the human response was swift and cold. Captain Yu-jin had been given authority to speak for all human military forces. Her message was broadcast across every frequency in the galaxy, reaching every species that had rejected humanity's friendship. "We offered our help," she said. In a voice like ice, "We offered our knowledge, we offered our lives. You chose to stand alone. You said you did not need human paranoia or human fear. Now face the consequences alone." The transmission ended with coordinates to massive supply caches that humanity was abandoning. These contained enough weapons and equipment to arm entire fleets, but they came with no instructions or tactical advice. The message was clear: humanity was done with the galaxy, but they would not let their former neighbors die without at least some tools to defend themselves. The Void Hunters continued their systematic advance through the galaxy, consuming everything in their path. They did not seem to be driven by hunger or conquest, but by something far more alien. A desire to return the universe to the empty silence that had existed before matter and energy first appeared. The proud stellar nomads tried to flee in their great ships, but discovered that the Void Hunters could follow them through hyperspace. Their ancient vessels that had traveled between stars for millennia were picked off one by one until only scattered survivors remained. The nomad fleet that had once been the terror of pirates and raiders was reduced to a handful of desperate refugees. The aquatic deeplings sealed their underwater cities and hoped that the ocean depths would protect them. But the Void Hunters did not need to breathe or worry about pressure. They simply walked through the water as if it were empty space and began consuming the cities from within. The seafloors that had been home to billions of aquatic beings became empty craters filled with nothing but salt water. Admiral Kyung-ho watched the destruction from the bridge of one of the last human warships still in the galaxy. His orders were simple: protect any remaining human civilians and prepare for the final jump to the new reality. But he could not help feeling a mixture of sadness and anger as he watched the galaxy burn. The same species that had called humans warmongers and aggressors were now discovering what real monsters looked like. The Void Hunters showed no mercy and took no prisoners. They simply erased entire civilizations as if they had never existed, leaving behind empty space where thriving worlds had once orbited their stars. The Galactic Council Chamber on Nexus Prime was one of the last places to be attacked. The ancient building where diplomats from hundreds of species had gathered to discuss trade and politics became a tomb as the Void Hunters flowed through its halls like liquid darkness. The council members who had voted to ignore human warnings died without ever understanding what they had brought upon themselves as the final human ships prepared to jump to the new reality. Admiral Kyung-ho left behind one last gift. He activated automated defense platforms around a few key worlds. These weapons would not be enough to stop the Void Hunters, but they might buy time for any remaining aliens to escape or find shelter. The platforms contained the most advanced human technology, including weapons that had been developed specifically to fight entities that existed outside normal space. The aliens would not understand how to use them properly, but perhaps some of them might survive long enough to learn. The jump to the new reality felt like stepping through a doorway made of lightning. Admiral Kyung-ho felt the familiar sensation of dimensional travel as space twisted around his ship. The last thing he saw of the old galaxy was the distant glow of dying stars as the Void Hunters continued their work of unmaking everything that had ever existed in the new reality. Humanity's ships emerged into a space that looked almost normal, but felt completely different. The stars were arranged in patterns that spelled out mathematical equations, and the planets orbited in perfect harmony as if the universe itself was singing a song of creation rather than destruction. Admiral Kyung-ho set course for Haven Prime, the artificial world that humanity was building in their new home. As his ship flew through the strange new space, he thought about the galaxy they had left behind. It would take time, but eventually the Void Hunters would consume everything, leaving only empty darkness where billions of civilizations had once thrived. The aliens had made their choice, and now they would face the consequences alone. But humanity had also made their choice. They had chosen to walk away from the hatred and fear that had poisoned their relationships with other species. Now they would build something new in the space between realities, something that would be stronger and more beautiful than anything the old galaxy had ever produced behind them. In the dying galaxy, the automated defense platforms continued their lonely vigil, protecting empty worlds from monsters that could not be stopped. They would fight until their power cells ran out, and then they too would fall silent, leaving the Void Hunters to complete their work of returning the universe to the darkness that had existed before the first star was born. Commander Taeho stood on the observation deck of the massive Arc ship called New Dawn and watched as thousands of smaller ships flew up from the planet below. Each ship carried families and their belongings away from the world they had called home for generations. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. As streams of light moved through the darkness of space like fireflies leaving a dying garden, the Arc ships were incredible to see. Each one was the size of a small moon, with cities built inside their protective hulls. Gardens and parks filled the inner levels, while the outer sections held factories and power generators. The ships had taken decades to build in secret shipyards, hidden in the empty space between stars. Now they were humanity's lifeboats carrying billions of people toward an uncertain future. 6 months had passed since Ambassador Hyun-woo walked out of the Galactic Council chamber. 6 months of frantic preparation as every human colony began the largest evacuation in their species' history. The process was like watching a flower close its petals as humanity pulled back from every corner of the galaxy they had called home. Dr. Minji worked day and night in her laboratory aboard the Arc ship, preparing for the journey ahead. She was the lead scientist on Project Exodus, the secret plan that would take humanity not just to another galaxy but to a completely different layer of reality. Her team had discovered that space itself had multiple dimensions, stacked on top of each other like pages in a book. The technology was beyond anything the other alien species had ever imagined. While they fought over trade routes and mining rights, humanity had been secretly developing ways to step sideways through Reality itself, the dimensional drives installed in each Ark ship could punch holes through the fabric of space and time, allowing them to travel to places that existed outside normal physics. Captain So Young had been promoted to help coordinate the evacuation efforts. She stood in the command center watching holographic displays that showed the progress of the exodus. From her position, she could see the entire galaxy and every human settlement that was being abandoned. The numbers were staggering: 300 billion humans living on over 10,000 worlds, all of them preparing to leave forever. The process was not just about moving people, it was about preserving everything that made humanity unique. Libraries filled with the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years, museums containing art and artifacts from old Earth, genetic samples from every plant and animal that humans had encountered in their travels through space. Everything that defined human civilization was being carefully packed and loaded onto the Ark ships. But the most difficult part was not the logistics. It was the emotional cost of leaving behind everything they had built. Many humans had never seen Earth, but they felt connected to the worlds where they had been born. Farmers on agricultural planets looked at the soil their families had worked for generations, knowing they would never see it again. The alien species were beginning to panic as they realized what was happening. The aquatic deeplings, who had relied on human technology for their underwater cities, sent desperate messages begging humanity to reconsider. Their cities were already failing without human engineers to maintain the complex systems that kept them running. The proud stellar nomads, who had always traveled between stars in their great fleet ships, offered to support all of humanity's proposals if they would just stay. They had secretly respected human determination and feared what would happen without human allies in the galaxy. Even the arrogant Scalan Empire began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. Their military leaders had always known that human tactical abilities were superior to their own, but their pride had prevented them from admitting it. Now they faced the prospect of defending their territory without the strategic brilliance that had kept the galaxy safe for centuries. But it was too late. The humans had made their decision, and their resolve was absolute. Every offer of compromise was politely declined. Every plea for reconsideration was met with silence. The evacuation continued according to schedule with military precision and cold efficiency. The most emotional moment came when Elder Jason, the oldest human alive at 300 years, took his final journey from Earth. He had been born when humans first began to explore other star systems and had lived through the entire age of galactic expansion. Now he sat in a transport ship looking back at the moon where human space travel had first begun. His memories were filled with hope and dreams of what humanity might become among the stars. He remembered the excitement of first contact with alien species and the joy of building new worlds in distant systems. The reality had been so different from those early dreams. Instead of galactic brotherhood, they had found suspicion and rejection. As his ship moved away from Earth, Elder Jaesung watched the blue marble of humanity's birthworld grow smaller in the viewport. Soon it would be empty except for the automated systems that would maintain it in case any humans ever returned. But he knew in his heart that this was truly good. But Dr. Minji called all the Ark ship commanders together for a final briefing before the dimensional jump. She explained that they were not just leaving the galaxy, but stepping into a reality where the laws of physics work differently. In this new dimension, humanity would have room to grow and develop without the political constraints that had held them back. The new reality existed in the spaces between normal space and hyperspace, a pocket dimension that could be expanded as needed. Here humanity could build worlds that defied conventional physics. Cities that floated in empty space, connected by bridges of pure energy, oceans that flowed upward toward artificial suns. But more importantly, they would be free from the fear and jealousy that had poisoned their relationships with other species. In the old galaxy, humanity had always been forced to hold back their technological development to avoid frightening their neighbors. Now they could grow and evolve into something greater than they had ever imagined. The final preparations were completed. As the last human outposts were abandoned, supply depots were left behind with coordinates broadcast to the alien governments. These contained enough food and medical supplies to help the remaining species survive what was coming, but they came With no instructions or promises of further aid, Commander Tejo gave the order for the dimensional jump, and reality twisted around the Ark ships like a kaleidoscope. The familiar stars of the Milky Way galaxy faded away as humanity stepped sideways through the layers of existence into a new reality where they could write their own destiny without interference from those who had rejected their friendship behind them. The galaxy continued its normal routine, but already the signs of coming disaster were beginning to show. Strange energy readings at the galactic rim ships disappearing in the outer territories. Reports of impossible phenomena that defied explanation. The Void Hunters were coming, and there would be no human fleets to stand against them. The great exodus was complete. Humanity had walked away from the galaxy that had spurned them, taking with them all the knowledge and technology that had kept their former neighbors safe. Now they would build something new in the space between realities, while the old galaxy learned the true cost of their pride and prejudice. Engineer Subin stood at the edge of the construction platform, watching as millions of worker drones assembled the framework for Haven Prime. The artificial world was taking shape in the pocket dimension that humanity had claimed as their new home. Unlike the rocky planets of the old galaxy, this world was being built from pure human imagination and will. The construction was unlike anything that had ever existed before. Floating cities hung in the air, connected by streams of pure energy that pulsed with different colors depending on the time of day. The buildings grew like living things, reaching toward artificial suns that provided warmth and light without the dangerous radiation of natural stars below. The floating cities' vast forests spiraled around gravity wells that had been carefully crafted to create impossible landscapes. Trees grew in perfect helixes, reaching toward the sky in patterns that would have been impossible under normal physics. The leaves changed color, not with seasons, but with the emotions of the people who lived nearby, creating a living artwork that stretched across continents. Dr. Wu Jin walked through the halls of the new Dimensional Research Institute, explaining to his students how humanity was evolving beyond what they had been in the old galaxy. The laws of physics in this new reality were more flexible, allowing for technologies that had been impossible before. In the old galaxy, we were always holding ourselves back, he said, his voice filled with excitement. We had to be careful not to develop weapons that were too powerful or technologies that might frighten our alien neighbors. Here we can explore the full potential of human creativity without those constraints. The students listened carefully as he described the new discoveries that were being made every day. Gravity could be programmed like software, creating areas where people could fly or where waterfalls flowed upward toward the sky. Time moved differently in various parts of the city, allowing researchers to work for subjective years, while only hours passed in the outside world. The most amazing discovery was that human consciousness itself seemed to work differently in the new reality. People could share thoughts and emotions more directly, creating a kind of collective intelligence that was still individual but also connected. The loneliness that had plagued humanity for thousands of years was finally being healed. General Hyrin commanded the military forces that were developing in the new reality, but her soldiers were very different from the warriors of the old galaxy. These new humans could think in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and their weapons were designed to work specifically against entities like the Void Hunters. The military research focused on understanding the nature of entropy and chaos. The Void Hunters were not just alien creatures, but fundamental forces of destruction that existed in the spaces between realities. General Hyrin scientists had discovered that order and creation were equally powerful forces that could be weaponized against the forces of unmaking. Her soldiers trained in special chambers where they learned to fight battles that took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously. They practiced with weapons that could cut through the fabric of space itself, and armor that existed partially outside normal reality, making them nearly impossible to destroy. But the most important part of the military development was not about weapons or tactics. It was about understanding that humanity's greatest strength had always been their ability to work together and support each other. The new reality enhanced this natural human tendency, allowing entire armies to fight as a single coordinated organism. The civilian population was also changing in remarkable ways. Children born in the new reality thought in patterns that their parents could barely understand. They saw solutions to problems that had stumped the greatest minds of the old galaxy, and they could manipulate the flexible physics of their new home with instinctive ease. Teacher Dong Hyan worked with the first generation of these new humans in schools that defied every concept of education that had existed before. Students learned by directly experiencing historical events or by visiting mathematical concepts that had been made into physical locations. A child could walk through a forest made of prime numbers or swim in an ocean of pure music. The children were not just learning faster, they were learning differently. They understood concepts that existed only in the new reality, and they could see connections between ideas that had never been linked before. Some of them could predict the future by reading the patterns in the energy streams that connected the floating cities. One young girl named Ara had developed the ability to communicate with the artificial intelligences that helped run the city. She could speak to the machines in their own language and understand their thoughts as if they were living beings. Her insights had led to breakthroughs in technology that seemed like magic to the older generation. The economic system of the new reality was based on creativity and cooperation rather than competition and scarcity. In the old galaxy, humans had been forced to compete for limited resources like any other species. Here they could literally create new matter and energy from the flexible fabric of space itself. People worked on projects that interested them rather than jobs they needed to survive. Artists created sculptures that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Musicians composed symphonies that could be heard with the mind rather than the ears. Scientists explored questions that had no answers in the old reality but could be solved through direct experimentation with the laws of physics. The most touching aspect of the new civilization was how it healed the wounds that humanity had carried from the old galaxy. For the first time in their history, humans did not need to fear or compete with other species. They could focus entirely on becoming the best version of themselves. Families that had been separated by the vast distances of galactic space were reunited in cities where travel between any 2 points took only minutes. People who had spent their lives feeling isolated and alone discovered that they could share their deepest thoughts and emotions with others who truly understood them. The artificial world of Haven Prime was not just a place to live, it was a work of art created by the collective imagination of an entire species. Every street and building and garden reflected the dreams and hopes of the people who had built it. The city itself was alive in a way that no human settlement had ever been before. As the months passed, the new reality continued to expand and evolve. Humanity was not just surviving in their new home, they were thriving and growing in ways that would have been impossible under the old constraints. The pocket dimension stretched and grew to accommodate new cities and new experiments. In living DR, Wu Jin often stood on the highest platform of the research institute, looking out at the impossible landscape that surrounded him in the distance. He could see the shimmer of dimensional barriers that protected their reality from the chaos of the space between universes. Beyond those barriers lay the old galaxy, where the Void Hunters continued their work of destruction. But here in the new reality, humanity was building something that could never be destroyed because it existed in the spaces between existence itself. They had learned to create rather than just survive, and they were becoming something greater than they had ever imagined possible. Transformation was not just technological or cultural, it was spiritual. Humanity was evolving into a species that could touch the fundamental forces of creation and use them to build worlds that existed beyond the reach of entropy and decay. They were no longer just another species struggling to survive, they were becoming gardeners of reality itself. And in the schools where the new generation learned to think in ways their parents could barely comprehend, Teacher Dong Hyan watched children who would grow up to be gods of their own, making not through conquest or domination, but through the simple human ability to imagine something better and then make it real. The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber opened with a deep sound that echoed through the huge room. Ambassador Hen Wu walked slowly down the long path toward the human section. His black uniform was clean and pressed, but his face showed the weight of many sleepless nights. Behind him, Captain So Young carried a heavy bag filled with data. Tablets and emergency reports from the outer space colonies. The chamber was enormous, almost too big for any normal person to feel comfortable. Inside, the ceiling stretched up so high that clouds actually formed near the top. Hundreds of different alien species sat in their special seats. Each group had their own area designed for their unique bodies. The reptilian scalens sat on heated stone slabs, while the crystal-like prism lords hung from the ceiling in glowing cages. The fish-like deeplings floated in giant water tanks with speaking devices. Shinwu took his seat at the human table and looked around the room. He had been coming to these meetings for 5 years, now 5 long years of trying to warn everyone about the danger that was coming from outside their galaxy, but every time he spoke, the other species just laughed or ignored him. They thought humans were too young and too scared to understand real galactic politics. Today was different, though. Today he had proof that even they could not ignore the meeting. Started when the ancient prison lord leader flashed a bright blue light. This meant it was time for everyone to be quiet. The first speaker was a tall Scalan general with dark green scales and sharp teeth. He talked about trade routes and mining rights. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. After him came representatives from dozens of other species. They talked about small problems, border disputes over empty planets, arguments about who could use certain space lanes, complaints about tax rates on imported goods. It was all so normal and boring, while the real threat was getting closer every day. Finally, it was Hyunwoo's turn to speak. He stood up slowly and walked to the center speaking platform. The room became quiet, but not because they wanted to hear him. Most of the aliens were just being polite. They had heard his warnings before, and they were tired of the Myungwoo began to speak in a calm voice that carried clearly through the huge chamber. My fellow council members, he said, I stand before you today with news that will change everything we know about our galaxy. For the past 3 years, human colonies on the outer rim have been disappearing, not destroyed by war or natural disasters, but completely erased from existence. A few aliens made small noises of disbelief. The Scalan general hissed softly. The prism lords flashed annoyed yellow colors. These are not pirates or raiders, Hyunwoo continued. They are something we have never seen before, something that comes from the empty space between galaxies. We call them the Void Hunters because they hunt entire star systems and leave nothing behind. He pressed a button on his tablet, and large screens around the chamber showed images of empty space where colonies used to be. The pictures were terrifying. Black holes in reality itself, where planets and stars had been completely removed. In the past month alone, we have lost contact with 12 human settlements, Hyunwoo said, his voice getting stronger. These were not small outposts. They were full colonies with millions of people, cities that had existed for hundreds of years. Now there is nothing left but empty space. The Scalan general stood up and made a loud hissing sound. That is enough of this human nonsense, he said in his rough voice. You come here every few months with these wild stories about monsters from space. We have real problems to discuss, not fairy tales meant to scare children. Several other aliens agreed with him. The prism lords flashed angry red colors. A group of bird-like creatures called the wind dancers made harsh screeching sounds. Shinwoo felt his patience finally breaking after years of being ignored. He looked around the room at all the different species that had rejected his warnings. Every single time he had tried to help them, every single time they had turned him away. Captain So Young stepped forward and whispered something urgent in his ear. Her face was pale and scared. The news she brought made Hyunwoo's heart sink even deeper. The Scalan general was still talking loudly about human paranoia and how young species always saw threats that were not real. He suggested that maybe humans had brought this danger on themselves through their aggressive expansion into space. Other aliens nodded in agreement. That was the moment when something inside Hyunwoo finally snapped. He walked back to the speaking platform and raised his hand for silence. The room became quiet again, but this time there was something different in the air, something that made even the most arrogant aliens pay attention. My fellow council members, Hyunwoo said in a voice that was now cold and hard, I have spent 5 years trying to warn you about this threat. 5 years of being ignored, mocked, and dismissed. You have made it clear that you do not want human help or human advice. He paused and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every alien leader. Very well, he continued. We will no longer waste our time trying to convince you of dangers you refuse to see. As of this moment, humanity formally withdraws from the Galactic Council. We are ending all military cooperation agreements, all trade partnerships, all diplomatic relations. The chamber erupted in chaos. Aliens began shouting in dozens of different languages. The Scalan general roared in anger. The Prism Lords flashed wild colors of shock and disbelief. The Deeplings created huge splashes in their tanks, but Hyanwu was not finished. We are leaving this galaxy, he announced, and his words cut through the noise like a knife. You have chosen to stand alone. Now you will face whatever comes alone. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small datapad. With one smooth motion, he dropped it on the floor in front of the speaking platform. The device contained everything humanity knew about the Void Hunters, their attack patterns, their weaknesses, their terrifying abilities. When you are ready to listen, he said, without turning back, it will be too late. Captain So Young followed him as he walked toward the exit. The other aliens were still shouting and arguing, but their voices seemed to fade away. The huge doors closed behind them with a final deep sound that echoed through the chamber. Outside in the corridor, Hyanwu stopped and took a deep breath. The decision was made. There was no going back now. Humanity would leave the galaxy that had rejected them and find a new home somewhere else. As they walked toward their ship, So Young spoke quietly. Sir, the other species will not survive without us. They do not understand what is coming. Unwu nodded sadly. That is their choice, Captain. They had their chance to listen. Now they must face the consequences. The human ship lifted off from the council station and headed toward Earth, where the greatest evacuation in human history was already beginning. Behind them, the galaxy continued its normal routine, unaware that it had just lost its greatest defenders. In the empty council chamber, the datapad still lay on the floor. Its screen was flashing with warnings about the approaching Void Hunters, but there was no one left to pick it up. The massive amphitheater that humanity had constructed for the trials was unlike anything the alien survivors had ever seen. The walls were made of crystallized time itself, showing glimpses of past and future events, while the floor consisted of pure possibility that shifted and changed based on the thoughts and actions of those who stood upon it. Dr. Changmin stood at the center of the arena, wearing simple robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself. As humanity's chief philosopher, he had designed the trials not to punish the aliens for their past mistakes, but to help them understand what they needed to become if they wanted to survive in the new reality. Representatives from every surviving alien species gathered in the arena. The Scalan regent stood with his remaining warriors, trying to maintain their dignity despite their obvious terror. The cracked Prism Lords floated in their crystal containers, while the Deeplings swam nervously in their portable tanks. The few remaining stellar nomads huddled together like lost children. Dr. Shangmin began to speak, and his voice carried clearly through the vast space without any need for amplification. The trials you are about to face, he said, are not about proving your worthiness to humanity. They are about proving your readiness to be part of something greater than any single species. The first challenge materialized around them, and suddenly the aliens found themselves standing in a perfect recreation of the old Galactic Council chamber, but this time the chamber was under attack by Void Hunters, and the alien representatives had to work together to defend it. The Scalan regent immediately tried to take charge, barking orders at the other species, like he had done in the old galaxy, but the Prism Lords ignored him and the Deeplings swam away from his commands. The stellar nomads began to panic as the Void Hunters approached the chamber. Dr. Shangmin watched as the aliens fell into their old patterns of behavior. The Scalans tried to solve the problem with brute force, while the Prism Lords attempted to use their energy weapons independently. The Deeplings retreated into their tanks, and the nomads prepared to flee. The simulation ended with all of them being consumed by the Void Hunters, just as their real civilizations had been. The aliens stood in shocked silence as they realized they had just repeated the exact mistakes that had led to their galaxy's destruction. Even faced with extinction, they could not overcome their pride and fear enough to work together effectively. The second trial began, and this time the aliens found themselves in a burning city where civilians of all species were trapped in collapsing buildings. The only way to save everyone was for each species to use their unique abilities in coordination with the others. The Scalens were strong enough to lift heavy debris, but they needed the Prism Lords to cut through metal barriers with their energy. Beings the Deeplings could navigate flooded areas, but they needed the Nomads to carry them to places where there was no water. Each species had abilities that were useless without the support of the others. This time the aliens began to understand what was expected of them. The Scalen Regent swallowed his pride and asked the Prism Lords for help. The crystalline beings dimmed their natural arrogance and focused their energy beams where the Scalens directed them. The Deeplings overcame their fear of the surface dwellers and allowed the Nomads to carry their tanks to areas where their swimming abilities were needed. The Nomads stopped trying to flee and instead used their ships to coordinate the rescue efforts. Slowly and painfully, the aliens began to work together. They saved most of the civilians in the simulation, but the process was clumsy and inefficient. Many people died because the aliens were still learning how to trust each other. The third trial was even more challenging. The aliens found themselves facing a choice between saving their own people or protecting members of other species who were in greater danger. A Scalen could save either a group of Scalen eggs or a larger number of Prism Lord crystals, but not both. The Deeplings had to choose between preserving their own water supplies or sharing them with dying Nomads. The Prism Lords could use their energy to either repair their own damaged crystals or to power life support systems for other species. This trial pushed the aliens to their emotional breaking point. Many of them had spent their entire lives believing that loyalty to their own species was the highest virtue. Now they were being asked to sacrifice their own people for the good of others. The Scalen Regent was the first to make the difficult choice. He directed his warriors to save the Prism Lord crystals, even though it meant allowing Scalen eggs to die. His people hissed in anger and disbelief, but he stood firm in his decision. The surviving Prism Lords saw his sacrifice and responded by using their energy to save Deepling habitats instead of repairing their own damaged crystals. The Deeplings in turn shared their precious water with the Nomads, who used their ships to evacuate everyone to safety. For the first time in the trials, the aliens succeeded completely. No one died in the simulation because they had learned to put the needs of the group above the survival of their own species. The fourth trial tested their ability to plan for the future together. The aliens were given the task of designing a new civilization from scratch. They had to create government systems that would prevent the mistakes of the past, while allowing each species to maintain their unique culture and identity. The discussions were heated and emotional as old prejudices and fears surfaced. The Scalens wanted a military hierarchy, while the Prism Lords preferred a council of elders. The Deeplings advocated for environmental protection, while the Nomads emphasized freedom of movement, but gradually they began to find common ground. The Scalens realized that their military strength was useless without the wisdom of the Prism Lords. The Crystals beings understood that their ancient knowledge needed to be tempered by the practical experience of other species. The Deeplings learned that their environmental concerns were shared by all the species who had lost their homeworlds. The Nomads discovered that true freedom came not from running away from problems, but from having the courage to stay and solve them together. The fifth trial was the most personal one yet. Each alien had to face their own role in the destruction of their galaxy. They were forced to relive the moments when they had chosen pride over wisdom, fear over courage, and hatred over understanding. The Scalen Regent had to watch himself mocking human warnings about the Void Hunters. He saw his own arrogance and prejudice reflected in the faces of his people, and he understood how his actions had doomed not just his. 2 years had passed since humanity disappeared from the galaxy and the old worlds were dying. The Void Hunters had consumed nearly half of all inhabited star systems, leaving behind empty spaces where thriving civilizations had once existed. The remaining alien species had finally learned to work together, but their cooperation had come too late to save their homes. The proud stellar Nomads now lived in a handful of damaged ships that limped through space searching for safe harbors that no longer existed. Their great fleet that had once numbered in the thousands was reduced to perhaps 50 vessels carrying the last survivors of their ancient culture. The Nomad children who had once played in the vast gardens of their ship cities Now huddled in cramped emergency shelters, the crystalline prism lords had lost their beautiful homeworld where they had grown for millions of years. The crystal cities that had focused starlight into art and music were now nothing but empty space. The survivors had managed to escape in small crystal ships, but they could no longer reproduce without the great focusing crystals that had been consumed by the void hunters. Even the mighty Scalan Empire had been forced to abandon their core territories. The reptilian warriors who had once boasted that they feared nothing in the galaxy now fled like refugees from the advancing darkness. Their massive war fleets had been reduced to a few hundred ships carrying the last of their eggs and young. The aquatic deeplings had suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. Their underwater cities had been their protection for eons, but the void hunters had walked through the ocean depths as if the water did not exist. Most of the deepling population had been consumed, and the survivors floated in emergency habitats that leaked constantly. In desperation, the remnants of the galactic Council had worked together to find humanity's new home. It had taken them months of searching through dimensional mathematics that their greatest scientists barely understood, but finally they had located the pocket reality where humanity had built their new civilization. Ambassador Baekyoung stood in the neutral meeting space that humanity had constructed. At the edge of their new reality, the room was made of crystallized light that could be shaped by thought and emotion. It was beautiful beyond description, but also served as a reminder of how far humanity had advanced beyond their former neighbors. The alien delegation that arrived was a pitiful sight compared to the proud representatives who had once dismissed human warnings. The Scalan regent, who had once mocked human paranoia, now crawled on his belly in the traditional Scalan gesture of absolute submission. His scales were dull and his eyes were hollow with despair. The surviving prism lords had lost their ability to flash colors of emotion. Their crystal bodies were cracked and dim like candles that were slowly burning out. They floated in the meeting space without speaking because they no longer had the energy to create the light displays that served as their language. The deepling representative had to be carried in a portable water tank because there were so few of them left that they could not maintain the great aquatic vessels that had once brought them to council meetings. The fish-like being pressed against the glass of his tank, and his gills moved frantically as he tried to communicate his people's desperation. The few remaining stellar nomads had sent their eldest survivor, an ancient creature whose body showed the scars of countless battles. His voice was weak and his hands shook as he tried to maintain the dignity that his people had once worn like armor. Ambassador Baekyoung looked at the pathetic group of survivors with a mixture of sadness and anger. These were the same beings who had rejected humanity's friendship and mocked their warnings. Now they came not as equals but as beggars hoping for scraps of mercy from the species they had scorned. The meeting began with the traditional galactic greeting, but the words sounded hollow when spoken by so few voices. The Scalan regent was the first to speak, and his voice cracked with emotion as he tried to find words that could somehow undo years of arrogance and pride. Great humans, he said, we know that we were wrong about everything. We should have listened to your warnings. We should have accepted your help. We should have treated you as the equals you always were. Please, we beg you to help us save what little remains of our civilizations. The Prism Lord managed to create a few weak flashes of light that translated as, we offer everything we have left, our knowledge, our technology, our very lives. If you will only help us survive. The deepling pressed his face against the glass of his tank, and his translator device spoke in a voice filled with desperation. We will serve humanity forever if you will just save our remaining cities. Our children are dying and we have nowhere else to turn. The stellar nomad elder spoke last, and his words carried the weight of a proud people who had been brought to their knees. We who once called ourselves the masters of space now come to you as refugees. We offer you our ships, our weapons, our very souls if you will help us find a new home. Ambassador Baekyoung listened to their pleas without changing expression. When they finished speaking, the silence stretched for long minutes. The aliens waited with growing terror, wondering if humanity would simply turn them away to die in the empty space between realities. Finally, the ambassador spoke, and his words surprised everyone in the room. We do not want your submission, he said in a voice that was Firm, but not unkind. We do not want your ships or your weapons or your technology. We already have everything we need to defend ourselves and build our new civilization. The aliens looked at each other in confusion and growing fear. If humanity did not want their offerings, then what hope did they have but Ambassador? Baekhyun continued speaking, and his next words gave them the first glimmer of hope they had felt in months. What we want is something that cannot be given or taken by force. We want proof that you have learned from your mistakes. We want to see that you can work together, not just for survival, but for the good of all species. He gestured, and the crystallized light around them formed into images showing scenes from the old galaxy. The aliens saw themselves as humanity had seen them, arguing over trivial matters, while real dangers gathered at the edges of their territory. You had everything you needed to stop the Void Hunters. The ambassador said the technology existed. The knowledge was available, the warnings were clear, but you chose to let pride and fear divide you instead of working together. The images changed to show the current state of the galaxy with vast empty spaces where civilizations had once thrived. The Void Hunters continued their work of destruction, moving systematically through the remaining star systems like a plague of living darkness. We will not make the same mistake again, the ambassador said. We will not return to a galaxy that has not learned the lessons of its own destruction, but we will offer you something else. He paused and looked at each of the alien representatives in turn. We will offer you the chance to join us in building something new, not as our servants or subjects, but as partners in a civilization that values cooperation over competition and wisdom over pride. The aliens stared at him in amazement. They had expected either rejection or demands for submission. Instead, humanity was offering them a chance to start over as equals in a new reality. But the ambassador was not finished, however. He continued, this offer comes with conditions. You must prove that you can work together without the fear of extinction driving you. You must show that you have truly learned from the mistakes that led to your galaxy's destruction. The crystallized light around them formed into a doorway that led to a series of testing chambers. These trials will measure not your strength or your intelligence, but your ability to sacrifice for the common good. They will test whether you can put aside the pride and prejudice that led to your downfall. The alien representatives looked at the doorway with a mixture of hope and terror. They understood that this was their last chance. The trials would determine not just whether they could join humanity in the new reality, but whether their species would survive at all. The Scalan Regent was the first to move toward the doorway. His people had been warriors for millennia, but now they would need to learn a different kind of courage, the courage to admit their mistakes and work with former enemies for the good of all. The other aliens followed him into the testing chambers, where they would face challenges that would either redeem them or destroy the last hope for their survival. The trials would test everything they thought they knew about strength and honor, and what it meant to be civilized. Ambassador Baekhyun watched them go with mixed emotions. Humanity had grown beyond the need for revenge, but they also understood that trust had to be earned. The aliens would face tests that would either transform them into worthy partners or prove that they were still the same prideful beings who had brought destruction upon themselves. The fate of the galaxy's survivors now rested in their ability to learn from their mistakes and embrace the cooperation that they had rejected for so long.